Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we are going to be discussing the end of the Iran deal, and I do think that deal is actually finished. Before we get started, I want to just do a couple quick points. We're doing this live. If this is your first time here, you might see there's a big chat window to the right. I would encourage you to ask questions, interact with other people who are watching this presentation. Please do not be abusive of anybody other than me. You can be as abusive of me as you would like, but if you're too abusive in the comments, you'll just get blocked, and we'll deal with the situation that way. So I've got an outline, a couple points that I want to work through. I'm a little bit frazzled. I stayed up pretty late reading State Department press conference transcripts and stuff. So I'm a little loopy, but I'm going to work my way through this outline. That's going to take, I don't know, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half hour, probably not that long. And then I'm just going to dive into the comments that you guys have been leaving, the chat questions. So I would encourage you to leave questions as we go along, but remember those questions, because when I say, all right, let's start the Q&A, I'm going to want to go through those questions again, and I probably won't be able to multitask by like scrolling up and like checking stuff out. Also today, I'm going to try to clean up my language. I think that on some of these live broadcasts in the past, I've been kind of appalled by just how many F thises and S thises I'm dropping. And with this topic, it's really hard. It's I picked the to use a reference from Airplane, I picked the wrong day to stop sniffing glue. This topic is incredibly frustrating. Donald Trump's interaction with the Iran nuclear deal. I think what we're seeing here is somebody who is privileging a political promise that he made that he didn't adopt out of principle. He just sort of adopted because he knew that it was a good talking point for Republicans. The Iran deal is the worst thing ever, and he has followed through on his promise to finally end it. And it's a tremendously frustrating thing to see. I think the part of his 11-minute presentation yesterday that made me the most angry was actually, and there was a lot in there to make me angry, as I will cover later. But the part that really got to me the most was at the end, when he talked about how he really wanted to help bring about a more peaceful world, and how he was open to negotiations. And it was just one of those real like up is down moments. There was no, that is not what Donald Trump is working towards. I think he's gotten a lot of credit recently, probably more than he is due, almost certainly more than he is due, for the beginnings of an opening in North Korea. I believe that's probably a little premature. We've had really pleasant photographs of the North and South Korean leaders shaking hands before, but we are at a good moment for the relationship in North Korea, and it's something to be really optimistic about. And yes, to the extent that Trump and his administration didn't get in the way of that, we should celebrate that. But as I am certainly not the only person to point out, this very much gets in the way of doing a good deal with North Korea, or doing any deal with North Korea. I think the chances are very high that any deal that happens with North Korea will be flouted and messed with. That's what's happened with all the older deals. But unilaterally destroying a multilateral deal like this, dealing with nuclear weapons, is not what you want to do if you want to come up with a better deal with somebody else, because the North Koreans are going to look at this and say, how can we ever trust the United States? But that's a point that you can get anywhere. Also, another point that you can get anywhere that is worth pointing out is that this was a good deal. This was a good deal designed to do what we wanted it to do. I'm very against U.S. intervention, as regular viewers of the channel will know. I don't support this sort of U.S. has to be everywhere and handle everything, Globocop, for lack of a better term, thing. I am very serious about nuclear non-proliferation, and I think that to the extent that anybody can work towards that, that is a worthwhile thing. If you watched Trump's announcement yesterday, it was this is something that is always done. He just very consciously always moving it away from the nuclear issue, because if you'd focus on the nuclear issue, and as anybody in the Trump administration other than Donald Trump who focuses on the nuclear issue can tell you, it's that the Iran deal worked. Iran was complying. Iran was pushed back from developing a nuclear bomb. The leader of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, is famously just fights tooth and nail against the Iran deal. Really hates it. But not the leader of the Israeli Defense Forces. This was actually kind of news to me. I had assumed that Israel was sort of in lockstep against the Iran deal, but I actually did some research on it last night, and no, that's not the case. Even anybody who's legitimately interested in the security of Israel is on the same page with me in thinking that anything that can stop Iranian progress towards a nuclear bomb is worthwhile. And the deal we had until yesterday involved, rigorous inspections, involved Iran handing over most of its uranium. There are a million better summing ups that you can read of why the Iran deal was good, what it was. You can check out with those. You can check those out. You can find that. You can find that pretty much anywhere. It's very frustrating. But the point that I was making, in rather a long loop, was that the nuclear deal worked. So you saw in Trump's announcement yesterday that he was trying desperately to shift it to anything else. Shift it to missiles, shift it to the standard libel that Iran is the greatest state sponsor of terrorism. I think we'll talk about both of those later. But I think the first thing to do is deal with the title of this film, of this video, this live presentation, and to point out that the end of the Iran deal, I think, is an appropriate way to describe what happened yesterday. I think there's a lot of discussion and back and forth right now about the survival of the nuclear deal. We've got our European allies. It was also, in that speech with Trump, it was fascinating the way that he introduced the allies that mattered, that he sort of name-checked people. So we've got our European allies who are really, really embarrassed. Like, I had expected them to have some amount of egg on their face, but I didn't quite realize the extent to which the Europeans cared about this deal. They're a lot closer to Iran. This is potentially more important to them. I think they're also somewhat invested in Middle East stability, and they recognize that constantly attacking Iran, the way we always have, is how you get things like the current issue in Syria. So Europe is tremendously invested, or was tremendously invested, in the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, and they have been defeated almost completely. There are some interpretations that the support for, I don't really buy this, because the French and British will bomb anything as long as it gets them standing on a podium with the United States. But one of the interpretations was that the speed with which Syria got bombed last month had a lot to do with France and Great Britain trying to curry favor with Trump and trying to save the Iran deal. And there's no question that Macron in particular, and I believe Merkel in the U.S. last week as well. But there's been a just full court press from our European allies to try to save this deal. And it's failed. I think an important thing to emphasize, I have seen this in a few places, but this is a very important thing. When Trump got up there and announced that the Iran deal was over, he was talking about sanctions on Iran, but mostly he was talking about sanctions on Europe. and to a lesser extent, other countries throughout the world. These are called secondary sanctions, and that I think has a lot to do. I don't think you can really understand Europe's powerful opposition to the end of the JCPOA without understanding that that's what Trump was announcing yesterday. Yes, there will be new sanctions on Iran from the United States, from the U.S. government perspective, sanctioning or at least announcing sanctions against any U.S. companies that do business with Iran. The thing is, at this point, there are not a lot of U.S. companies doing business with Iran. I think I did read something about a Boeing contract, but just with how automotive stuff goes, how aviation stuff goes, that would have been years before that it actually come to fruition. But the United States, with the Iran deal, took away its secondary sanctions. It basically stopped forbidding. It's much more complex than this. There's a whole bunch of levels to this. But to oversimplify, with the signing of the Iran deal, it's not like the Iran nuclear deal. It's not like the United States stopped sanctioning Iran. What it did was it did away with its secondary sanctions. It stopped sanctioning foreign companies that did business with Iran. So there's still a whole bunch of sanctions on Iran from the United States dating back to the hostage crisis in 1979, 1980, stuff to do with missile technology, which we'll talk about later. So as far as the practical implications for U.S. business of this change, there's not really a really big one, unless somebody like Boeing was planning on making a ton of money from this new openness. Europe, it's different, and the rest of the world, it's different. Those sanctions were mostly okay. I don't want to hang my hat on that, but a significant portion of the world's sanctions against Iran came about because the United States forced it. It was sort of a carrot and a stick thing. People liked Obama, but there's also the incredible enforcement power, the incredible financial enforcement power that the United States can bring to bear. So sorry, there's a little traffic out there. So the rest of the world sanctions were sort of enforced by the United States, and we've still got court cases going through U.S. courts against foreign nationals that had violated those sanctions. So that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about consequences for Iran. That's not what Trump was really announcing yesterday. What he was announcing was consequences for people all over the world, specifically in Europe. I think probably because by dollar value, they're going to be some of the larger ones. Sanctions on people who are doing business with Iran. And that's a much, much more sweeping thing. And it's also, I think, an interesting contrast between the way the Obama administration did stuff and the way the Trump administration did stuff. I've mentioned elsewhere how, despite the fact that I am not an Obama fan, not a big fan of Obama foreign policy, I do think that the Iran nuclear deal was one of the more, frankly, heroic things I've seen from a U.S. president. I mean, as far as working in opposition to the military-industrial complex, you've got Eisenhower's farewell speech back in 1960, and you've got Obama's effort to do the nuclear deal. And it was a tremendously complex effort with a million different moving parts. I've tried to read the JCPOA a couple times, and I don't think I've gotten much further than the preamble. The amount of underlying stuff and complexity, and you had the Department of Energy doing this, and then Kerry and Obama working with every leader imaginable and talking and this. I mean, it's just this carefully crafted, tremendously complex thing. And Trump comes in and he's just like a baboon shitting on stuff. Excuse the language. It's extraordinary. There's been no real setup for this. It's all stick. There's no carrot. There's a great transcript going around of some journalists interviewing some State Department folks. It's clear that this is happening. This is not the way that it's been for the past 3 to 6 months. There was a certification that was required from Trump every 3 months to the U.S. Congress that Iran was in compliance with the deal, and Trump had been sort of backing off from that in different ways for gosh, it was about a year now. So that wasn't anything concrete. That wasn't anything. There was always something up in the air. What's going to happen? Like this is now concrete, and it's not just. Finally, Trump has done a little bit of work with his administration, or at least they knew this was coming. It is clear that these secondary sanctions I was talking about, are coming into effect, and they're coming into effect very soon. I think there's a 90-day tranche and then a 6-month tranche, depending on where in the what kind of economic activity it is. It's sort of a wind down, and forgetting the exact technical terms that were used. Basically, any foreign company that's involved in Iran has about 6 months to get out. This is the U.S. government telling any foreign company involved in Iran to get out or face sanctions from the U.S. government within 6 months if it involves finance or oil stuff, or 3 months if it involves anything else. Just sort of an interesting differential. That's crazy. So to once again refer to the title of this presentation, there is this sort of hope, this idea that somehow Europe, Russia, China, and Iran are going to be able to save this. I think the idea that Russia and China are going to want to save this is probably overblown. Russia loves the idea of massive sanctions against Iran because, as we saw yesterday, that's a great way to goose oil prices. I talk a lot on this channel about how I don't believe oil prices are going to come back. But we now see both West Texas Intermediate and Brent crude prices, the sort of two most prevalent standards for a barrel of oil. Those are now both in the 70s for the first time since 2014. And that is this issue. I mean, it's Venezuela to an extent, but it is this issue. I believe Iran exports, don't quote me on this, somewhere around 2 to 3 million or 2 to 4 million barrels of oil a day. If the sanctions come back, then that could go down. I actually don't think that is going to go down massively, but it does mean that for market purposes, for speculators and whatnot, the oil price goes up. It was interesting yesterday, before 2 o'clock, 2 o'clock-ish, when Trump made that announcement, oil prices were actually down 3% that day, perhaps because people were thinking, oh, well, he's probably just going to back off again. And then this morning, they've not only gotten all of that back, but they're like up another 3%. Or something like that. And I mean, so anyway, Russia, I think, is unlikely to be, despite saying all the right things, probably isn't going to be heartbroken by the idea that this deal goes away. China isn't going to be heartbroken by yet another massive own goal from the Trump administration. China is always happy to see the United States make an ass of itself because they are a strategic competitor. So I don't think the U.S., I don't think Russia and China are going to be that invested in saving the JCPOA. And it doesn't really matter to them anyway, because Russia is an oil exporter and China is going to be buying the oil from Iran anyway. The era where it was possible to actually cramp down on that is pretty much over. But for the European countries that want to save this, I mean, that's the cover of the top of the fold on the BBC website right now is talking about their desperate attempts to save this. I don't think it's going to happen. In the description, you can find a produced video, not a live one, that I made about 6 months ago, talking about the potential of this forming an actual broad anti-U.S. coalition. And I was sort of comparing that to the Suez Crisis in 1956 and how that sort of ended the British Empire. That was more of an interesting thought experiment, as I mentioned in the video. I don't think that this sort of coalition of people yet has the power to challenge the United States on an issue like this. I just don't buy it. I just don't see Merkel, May, having that, or rather their countries, yet having that ability to challenge the United States like this. I think as a prestige or a pride thing, they're going to attempt to, they're going to drag it out a little bit. But whether it's their countries that sort of gives up on this, or it's Iran that gives up on this, I believe this is now a dead letter. In Iran, they were burning American flags in the parliament yesterday on the floor of their parliamentary body. But honestly, I don't think there's been a massive change a massive change that's taken place here. I think as soon as Trump was elected, the Iran deal was the election of Trump that did the amazing damage to Iran and the JCPOA, and this just sort of formalizes it. This just makes it clear that the deal is never going to be salvaged from their perspective. This gets into, there's a lot of talk in Washington, D.C., sort of neocon circles more generally. It's interesting. I feel like I'm beginning to get the sense that the standard view is it's really a shame that these nuclear provisions were gone, but Iran really is a bad actor. They really are violating the spirit of the deal, et cetera, et cetera. The United States has never honored the spirit of the deal from their perspective. I guess sanctions relief did happen in 2015 before the delivery of the nuclear program or something that, regardless, within a year of, or even before the initial enactment of sanctions relief, Donald Trump announced his candidature for the presidency. And actually, even before it was clear that he was going to be the Republican nominee, I believe opposition to the Iran deal was sort of a standard thing for Republican candidates. So yes, they got sanctions relief, they got some of the money that they were owed, but the idea of the Iran nuclear deal was that Iran was going to be welcomed back into the community of nations, and if not anything that elevated or whatnot, they were going to get the ability to interact economically. But because Trump was there, and also just Republican Party talking points were there was this tremendous amount of instability. So you've got sanctions relief in sort of 2015, you've got the election heating up, and Iran being a tremendous issue in it, the Iran deal being a tremendous issue in it, just the next year. So if you're a business who's contemplating going into Iran, creating a long-term relationship, selling serious goods, and Iran desperately needs those airplanes that Boeing and Airbus were going to spend to them. I mean, they've got a lot of their big infrastructure dates back to the Shah. That's how much we have brutalized this country. I mean, they don't have aircraft in large numbers that date from after the 1970s. I mean, it's pretty brutally crushed place. So if you're a business person who's outside of Iran, who is going to get seriously invested, open an office, this, that, and the other thing, you were just waiting. You were waiting this whole time. So Iran never got what it thought it was going to get out of this deal. It never got the sort of economic resurgence, ability to deal with folks large scale. Obama apparently used to tell people okay, we're not doing any business with Iran, but I promise you it's fine. Europe, you can do whatever you want with Iran in terms of banking, this, that, and the other thing. Any sensible banking entity in Europe would have said, wait a second, I see this Trump guy, I'm going to just wait. And those people were vindicated yesterday because as of last night, the U.S. government is now going after anybody in Europe who does any kind of banking business with Iran. There's two qualifications to that. There's this 6-month sort of wind down period for foreign business in Iran. And also there is still some up in the air here. As with anything in modern government, it is always more complex than that. OFAC, it's an acronym in the U.S. government that I've forgotten. Office of Financial Access Control or Financial. Anyway, OFAC is OFAC is the relevant agency that implements sanctions. And it's going to be interesting how this works. It's not entirely clear. What's clear is that these secondary sanctions are back. They are back in a big way. Waivers could be issued. OFAC could just decide not to really bug people from Germany, France, and the UK as much. We just don't know. But generally, any business person who decided, I'm just going to wait on this Iran thing because I don't believe that the JCPOA is really going to last. Anybody who made that decision was vindicated yesterday. So you've got these European countries that just did go in a few sort of big ticket ways, did go into Iran, and they have basically gotten burned. There is a possibility. I was interested to learn yesterday that there is some interaction with around Cuba, where the U.S. government is trying to go back on some of the opening and trying to sanction European countries that do business in Cuba. I honestly didn't have the chance to read up on that as much as I would like, but I was kind of heartened to see that, and it did make me think that the Europeans have a little more spine than I used to think they had to, but it is quite a different thing. Cuba, a nice Caribbean island with beloved of all millennial tourists. That's a far cry from Iran, which is obviously one of the crowning obsessions of the U.S. military-industrial complex. I just don't think that Europe will have the leeway to really step up on this issue and become a new world leader, crafting this JCPOA thing that kicks the United States out of the room, even though the United States wants to run out of the room. I don't see that happening yet. I can envision some sort of last ditch face-saving measures that could last up until, 6 months from now. But the thing is, Iran now knows that it's not going to get any of the sort of spirit of the deal benefits that they were promised. Business is now running out of Iran in droves, never actually showed up there in the first place, and they're just not going to get what they were promised in the deal. So the negotiations will limp on. There'll probably be a big signing ceremony where every leader except for Donald Trump, has a handshake, or this, that, and the other thing. But within the next couple months, 6 months or a year, I think it's just gonna fall apart. Because it's also quite possible we'll be in a shooting war with Iran. Possible we'll be in a shooting war with Iran by then. So maybe they'll decide that time to stop dealing with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association. Inspectors, and the deal will finally fall apart. It's a real shame. All right, what else have I got here on my outline? Just a brief note. I know I've hit this again and again and again, but this Iran as the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. That's how Trump opened his speech yesterday, and it's ridiculous. By the definition that the United States government has constructed, that has very little accord with the way anybody with any common sense views the concept of terrorism, then yes, I suppose, according to this special definition that the U.S. government has set up, Iran could be seen as the biggest state sponsor of terrorism. But there's a really fundamental difference between the kind of terrorism that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. government supports, which is actually the vast majority of the terrorism that bothers publics in the West, from the lone wolf suicide bombers inspired by Saudi Arabia's Sunni jihadist ideology to actual ISIS, Al-Qaeda that were largely built up by Saudi money, or at least sort of Sunni money, not just Saudi. There's also Gulf countries. That like horrific stuff that makes all the headlines and that actually kills people in Western countries, that's all Sunni stuff. That's all Saudi Arabia stuff. But it was also interesting in 2018 in Trump's speech, he had to reach back to find instances of where Iranian terrorism had actually plausibly caused the deaths of people from the West, he had to lean back to the 1980s. To find terrorism that killed people that can be to some degree connected to Saudi Arabia, you don't need to go back any further than last month. Yeah, but for this, he had to go back to the Marine barracks bombing, which is still pretty heavily denied by the Iranian government, but I tend to believe, the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut in 1983, that I do believe can plausibly be connected to Iran. But it's crazy that in 2018, to talk about Iran as a sponsor of terrorism, he has to go back to 1983, or these embassy bombings in 1998, that I do believe there are some plausible connections to Iran, but these bombings were carried out by Al-Qaeda. By the U.S. definition, which I'll get into in a second, Iran is a big state sponsor of terror. But if you actually want to find an instance of what most people in the world and the public of the United States sees as terrorism, you got to go back to the 80s and 90s to find Iran at all connected to that. I know I've covered this issue many, many times, but it's sort of a slightly new wrinkle on this is you compare Iran's support for terror, and I want to put that in air quotes, to Saudi Arabia or Sunni funders of terror, that I'm less interested in putting in air quotes. There's a very different nature to these things, because I am comfortable calling Hezbollah a terrorist organization, but I know many people who view this channel are not. I know that with the forces that Iran supports and with the money that the U.S. government is definitely including in its calculation, they are supporting militias and whatnot with goals that are outside of, I'm going to strap a bomb on myself and kill a lot of people for a stupid idea. These are things like Hezbollah that are supporting sort of quasi-nationalist goals, like all of the militias in Iraq and Syria. They're actually serving political goals. These are actual actors. These are military actors. Yes, some of them have made it onto the list of the U.S. list of terror organizations, but what these folks are doing functionally are not just slaughtering innocents. They are fighting on battlefields. The most, I think this has become, this choice to call Iran the largest state sponsor of terrorism has gotten even more ridiculous than it used to be over the past 4 or 5 years, because Iran is actually in a weird quasi-alliance with the United States government when the United States government was actually bothering to bomb ISIS. Iran did a lot more to fight ISIS, did a lot more to fight terrorism than the U.S. government ever did. So keep in mind that when the United States says that Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism, that a lot of that terrorism funding money is actually fighting ISIS. That's what I'm talking about, the complexity here, and this sort of throwing a whole bag of apples and oranges into a bushel and calling it lemonade is sort of what's going on with this calling Iran the biggest state sponsor of terrorism thing. I think it's a dramatic oversimplification that makes for some dumb sound bites. And also none of the terrorist attacks that you think of or are bothered by can be connected to, as people in the Western world, apologies, can be attributed to Iran, like at all. Because they're actually supporting militias on the ground that are doing things like defending the Syrian government or fighting ISIS. The other thing is this missile technology thing, and talked about this before too, but I learned a bit more. There's a great article I read recently. I wish I could remember the publication, but it talked about what an Iran-Saudi Arabian war would look like. The Saudi Arabian military costs about, I really do think it was something like 10 times more than the Iranian military each year, and it's pretty clear that the Iranian military is a lot better. Look at what's happened in Yemen versus what's happened in Syria. Actually, that's not a fair comparison because Iran is supporting the established government on the ground, whereas Saudi Arabia is involved in some screwed up neo-colonial project in Yemen. So that's not particularly fair. But Saudi Arabia, one of the main reasons for its continued existence is the fact that it drops hundreds of billions of dollars on massively expensive U.S. weapon systems. Iran has not had the ability to do that, and it's fascinating. It's a really interesting thing to look into because there's a lot of U.S. ideology, propaganda, whatnot, talking about just how the terrible risk of Iranian hegemony. They're going to take over the region, and then you realize, I think the thing that the U.S. government might hate the most about Iran is that they've been this impressive a military actor with almost no annual military budget because they haven't been able to buy these weapons. For 40 years, they've been massively sanctioned by the United States and to a lesser degree other arms manufacturers. So they are flying like F-14s or something like that, like Top Gun, that famous, that iconic 1980s movie with Tom Cruise, like Top Gun. Tom Cruise in the 80s was flying more updated military technology than Iran has. They've still got a lot of tanks and planes from the time of the Shah, the dictator that was overthrown in 1979. So they just don't have a lot to bring to the table in this sort of modern technological crazy warfare. The one exception is missiles, missile technology. They have developed their own range of missile technology, and it is vital to their defense, to their self-defense as a country. They don't have any of the other bells and whistles that the other folks do. And because of that, I believe they've gotten, I am not a military technology analyst at all. Anything I have on this is very secondhand. Can't claim any knowledge there. But my understanding is that Iran's missile technology is threatening. Perhaps if I'm listening to the United States and Israel on that, then obviously I need to read some other stuff. But this is vital to the self-defense of Iran as a country. And it is absurd for the United States to, having signed this nuclear deal, then just decided that missile technology should be part of it as well. That's absurd. Iran is one of the most besieged countries in modern history. The idea that they just can't defend themselves or that they are doing something offensive for trying to develop some technologies to defend themselves requires a complete ignorance of history. You've got the 1980s, which is one of the most savage interstate wars after World War II in the world. I'm trying to think of another example that was more brutal between two sort of developing countries than the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. So Saddam Hussein's war machine was created by U.S. allies, to a small degree by the United States, but mostly by U.S. allies under U.S. encouragement in the 1980s to savagely attack Iran. So they had to deal with that for 10 years. And then in 2002, George W. Bush announced that Iran was part of the axis of evil, which is I'd call a sort of de facto declaration of war against Iran. Iran. Oh yeah, and then the United States occupied both Afghanistan and Iraq, the two countries on either side of Iran. So this whining about Iran's missile technology, about a country who can't afford or has been blocked from buying any of the modern modern components of a military power, I find that pretty offensive and ridiculous. Missile technology, terrorism, not a big fan of either of those. I would like to talk very quickly about this sort of Iranian foreign policy. And what's interesting is that I think that Trump has created a situation that he talked a lot about Iranians' nefarious influence in the region or whatnot, supporting the ally that they'd always supported against a massive attack from the United States, talking about Syria. It's this sort of thing that the U.S. president sees as nefarious. Also, I'd argue that while I believe that Iran's involvement in Yemen is overstated, I would argue that supporting a local militia against an imperialist power, two imperialist powers, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, is actually a pretty great thing to do. But anyway, a lot is made of Iran's influence in the region. And I think that the Washington, D.C. thinking, not just Trump, has got this exactly backwards. It's actually war that gives Iran the influence that it has. And I think this action that has been taken with the nuclear deal is almost designed to make this issue worse. When the JCPOA was first put into place, or was in the run-up to the JCPOA, Obama put together this incredible network of international countries that agreed, some willingly, some unwillingly, to get on board with sanctioning Iran. The United States doesn't buy much oil from Iran. The United States has almost zero economic activity. Not almost zero. There's actually tremendous Persian diaspora in the United States. Anyway, that gets off topic. But there isn't a lot of economic weight. There isn't a lot of buying of Iranian oil. It's the rest of the world that would be able to bring Iran back to the table. And in the Trump era, I don't really see them as interested. There's going to be no new deal. Folks who deal with Iran are going to be sanctioned. But I think that this sort of also comes down to sort of an Iran's people versus Iran's foreign policy dichotomy that I've talked about a bit before on the channel. This action by Donald Trump is going to be very bad for the Iranian people. It's going to be very bad for any kind of complex economic interaction. It's going to be very bad for anything that involves improving the infrastructure of Iran, bringing more business activity to Iran. It's going to be very, very bad for this. As far as getting in the way of Iranian foreign policy and Syria, Yemen, regional stuff, getting in the way of the regime, I think this will be useless, actually, because the meaningful economic interaction in Iran is going to be blocked by this. But the actual purchase of oil, petroleum products, that money that flows more or less directly to the Iranian government, the US and the Trump administration is not going to be able to stop that because it's oil, it's petroleum products. You pump them out and you sell them, and there'll be some black market stuff. There'll be all kinds of finagling. It'll be more difficult for Iran to bring its petroleum products to market, but it's not going to slow things down in any meaningful way. Whereas Obama could actually, through carrots and sticks, get the amount of oil that Iran could sell down, Trump is not going to be able to do that. Trump has the power to destroy the Iranian deal, has the power to keep European companies from taking advantage of the 80 million person market in Iran. Trump has that power. Trump, I do not believe, has the power to make any meaningful progress against the Iranian regime, the Iranian foreign policy, and regime destabilization, because that's just oil money. He's actually, as every U.S. hardliner does, he has done a great service to the Iranian hardliners. He has vindicated them. For years, the sort of old school hardline anti-U.S. establishment has been saying, "Don't deal with the U.S. They'll screw you." Well, they look right now. Trump has made them right. So I think that supports the regime, but also the fact that, once again, killing this deal means that no interesting economic interaction can happen for the Iranian people, but the oil is going to keep flowing. So this is great for the regime. This is great for regime, for destabilization. It's also made the Iranian people angry to a degree. The Iranian regime really was looking pretty shaky over the past 6 months, and maybe that'll continue. But I think it's also very likely that this will make them more powerful. And it also sort of crushes the aspirations of the Iranian people to actually finally get some kind of modern trade thing going. And it's very sad. So yeah, to sum up, the nuclear deal should call it regional destabilization. Anyway, um, yes, I think I want to talk about this whole idea of a Shia bridge across the Middle East. That's this idea that, okay, there's Iran here. They got a lot of influence in Iraq thanks to Bush, thanks to Bush's destruction of that country and the empowering of the Shia majority. Syria, they've always had power in Syria. It's kind of ridiculous that this is seen as something new. They really rely in reporting on Syria to sell this proxy war angle. They really rely on people not knowing that Russia and Iran have been established in Syria since the 70s, if not before. It's actually NATO, the US, the Gulfies that are destroying a country and a relationship. Anyway, I can go off on that in great detail. So this idea that's now being sold to morons by morons in Washington, D.C. is this idea that there's this Shia land bridge between Iran and the Mediterranean, and Iran is becoming regionally dominant. To deal with that, we need more war and we need more muscular threatening. And I think that sort of fundamentally mischaracterizes what's going on here. It's not peace that threatens Iran. It's not war that threatens Iran. It's peace. We see this over and over again. As soon as one of the countries in this region calms down, they get a lot less interested in talking to Iran. Iran, because it has had to evolve a military concept and approach under siege, is a tremendously good friend to have if you are screwed. In 2014, when ISIS was rolling across Iraq and it looked like they might make it into Baghdad, it wasn't the US that saved Iraq, it was Iran. They are really, really useful for an embattled and besieged leader. That's why they have been so valuable to Assad. And they actually, Assad, Iran and Hezbollah have been a tremendous part of Assad's continued survival. That is undeniable. But what's interesting is what happens after. Iraq has now, well, let's not overstate it, but Iraq is in a more peaceful place than it has been in quite some time. There's actually some really promising stuff. Actually, I haven't looked at it in a couple months, could be gone by now because it's Iraq, but it had almost seemed like there was the beginnings of a sort of understanding between Shia and Sunni populations. You've got a Shia leader that's more popular with the Sunnis than he is with the Shia now, and stuff like that. Who knows how long that's going to last. But Iraq is more peaceful than it has ever been, and the first thing it did, even before they proclaimed a victory against ISIS, is warm up to Saudi Arabia, Iran's supposedly great nemesis. The leaders in these countries are politicians. They have national sentiments in their own countries. They have local powers they want to cater to. They want to play tremendously, they want to play really careful games. They want to play foreign powers off of each other, this, that, and the other thing. They can't do any of this if they don't have the leisure of peace. If they're in war, if they're in a foxhole, if ISIS is coming screaming down the highway, if the United States has got $1 billion CIA program throwing jihadists at you like they had in Syria, you desperately want Iran on your side. But the second peace starts breaking out, you want somebody with deeper pockets. Iran has an incredible military tool that's very useful for the kind of, sort of sad, vicious wars that are fought in the Middle East now. Once that's gone, in Syria, what's interesting is watching the Russian role and influence in Syria go up dramatically as the place gets more peaceful. Because even though Russia might not have that much discretionary funding anymore, they've got more than Iran. And it's crazy the amount of suffering and sacrifice that Iran and Hezbollah have gone through for Syria and for Assad. And Assad is pivoting towards the Russians as quickly as he can. So this whole Shia bridge thesis or idea, this whole idea that Iran now has access to the Mediterranean and they're going to be the new Hitler, hogwash, is tremendously reliant on a bunch of fantasies, and also leaves out the fact that it's actually continued war and instability that makes Iran powerful in these countries. It's absurd. Like you look at this and people are like, OMG, the Houthis have sent a missile using Iranian technology towards Riyadh. What are we going to do? Well, gee, I don't know. Like maybe Saudi Arabia shouldn't have been bombing Yemen into rubble for 4 years. It's extraordinary. Like just the complete lack of perception we have in Washington D.C. All right, I think I'm almost done with. Yeah, I wanted to talk briefly about, because I know I haven't had a chance to look at the comments here. But I know somebody's talking about Israel in there. There's always somebody talking about Israel in there. And I want to talk just briefly about Netanyahu and that absurd presentation he did last week that Trump name-checked. He's got 11 minutes to talk about destroying Obama's greatest foreign policy achievement. And he spent some time talking about lies that Netanyahu had put forward last week in a ridiculous English language it's been called Bibi's TED Talk. I honestly can't remember right now. Netanyahu's the prime minister of Israel, right? Not the president. The leader of Israel did a sort of TED Talk presentation revealing these binders full of information about the Iranian nuclear program, and pitched it as this sort of revelation. And even standard military industrial complex propaganda rags like the New York Times had to admit, this was stuff we already knew. The big reveal that Trump, talked about in his talk was the fact that even though Iran had never acknowledged that they had a program to build a nuclear bomb, they did, and we have the proof now. And it's like, yeah, but Obama spent his the entire second term of his administration and an incredible amount of diplomatic capital to avert having an Iranian nuclear bomb. It's not like anybody didn't know that was the issue there. Like, we didn't motivate six or seven countries and a worldwide sanctions regime to keep Iran from having a peaceful nuclear electricity program. It's like one of the, even the most, even super anti-Iran people were looking at this presentation like, what the are you talking about? Just really, the guy's a clown, almost on a Trumpian level, which is impressive. And unfortunately for Israel, he's been a dominating feature of their politics. I think he's been in and out of power, but he's been around, I think, since I was in high school. Actually, yes, quite literally, since I was in high school 20 years ago. Bibi Netanyahu has had a serious, I think he was prime minister back then as well, which is nuts and very bad for Israel. Another thing I had mentioned earlier, how surprised I was because Netanyahu does such a great job of sucking up all the oxygen. There were very serious, significant, I believe the leader of the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, wanted to keep the nuclear deal. But because Netanyahu, so desperate for the spotlight under serious corruption charges, has been sort of running around the country screaming Iran deal for so long, I didn't even know that there were people that rational in Israel. And that's, I guess that's on me and my constant avoidance of this topic, as I'm sure people in the comments are complaining about. There is one other thing, this sort of assumption that I did a Medium post a little while back that I've been sort of sprinkling in the comments about the idea that it's all about Israel. It's all about the Zionists. It's all about this, that, and the other thing. And that's what's really motivating what's happening in the Middle East. You know, Israel's telling the United States what to do. And I think maybe this has something to do with the year or so I spent as a stockbroker around the turn of the century, but it's not some sinister Zionist plot. If you just look at what happened on the markets, it's just dumb greed. Before Trump's announcement, I mentioned that oil prices had like a 3 or 4% swing on that announcement. Defense companies went through the roof. If you've got, I meant to look at that, but the Dow Jones Industrial Average, a lot of people have exchange traded funds that just sort of invest in all of those little slices of all those stocks. There's got to be at least a couple defense companies in the Dow Jones. It was down 100 points before Trump's announcement yesterday. It went up another 150 points. War makes money. War makes a ton of money. It is terrible for everybody in the Middle East, Israel included. History has shown, or at least 20th century history has shown, if we can stay in the era of the long peace, a second half of 20th century history has shown that civil wars don't last forever. It's just not, even back in the bad old days, wars would end. And I think I'm beginning to see some real durability in Iraq and Syria. And even though for some short-sighted Israel policymakers, it may look good that Iraq and Syria have been in such a shambles for so very long, but they're getting their stuff together. And be it 10 years from now, be it 15 years from now, Syria and Iraq will be big players again with stronger systems, and they will remember. So no, I don't think any of this is to the benefit of Israel or the Zionist project. It's to the benefit of me, somebody who's got a 401k or any other kind of retirement account or pension or something like that invests in the equity markets or the debt markets of the sort of broader U.S. imperium. This war happens because war makes money, and that's what's happening here. And it's really sad. And Israel is suffering less than its Arab neighbors, but that won't be the case for long. All right, I think I have covered most of everything I wanted to cover here. And I talked for an hour. I am a loudmouth. I apologize. Can we have questions? I'm now ready to deal with the Q&A period. Thank you to 93 of you for sticking around. Okay, that's a great question. Do you think the world as it's, sorry, I can't read Cyrillic, I'm embarrassed to admit, but the question, do you think the world as it stands has been planned by any one country or society? No, I do not believe that. I think there are a range of theories about this, that, and the other thing. I think that there are groups of individuals, certain places and times that have a tremendous impact. Give us a wide range of new technologies or something along those lines. I think China during the Song Dynasty, or ancient Greece, or one of my favorites is the period in sort of the 1660s in London with the Isaac Newton and the Royal Society that sort of gave us modern physics, the underpinnings of engineering and a million other things. Really great book by Neil Stephenson, really great 3 books by Neil Stephenson, fiction called oh my gosh, I've forgotten. What are those called? The Baroque Cycle, that sort of cover that. So, I mean, it's not that I'm not like super like, oh, it's all willy-nilly and, I believe in progress. I believe, been having some arguments with a book editor right now on that. I believe in progress. I believe in steps forward. I believe that certain groups of people, certain sets of ideologies, certain this, that, and the other thing can take us forward. But I don't believe that these people are all knowing. If you look at ancient Greece, and like, there's a lot to admire there, but it was also kind of a disgusting slave state that was all about war and death and killing and whatnot. If you look at Isaac Newton, possibly one of the top three most important scientists in human history, and he was nuts. Like he maybe invented calculus, probably invented calculus and modern physics and optics and this, that, and the other thing. But he spent like the last couple decades of his life really trying to figure out how the Bible was going to tell him how to make gold. He got really into alchemy. So yes, I do believe certain people move us forward, but the idea that there's somebody sort of sitting back there with a plan, be it the space lizards or the Zionists or this, that, and the other thing. I think that hasn't. I read a lot of history, and I haven't seen any of that. Other questions? Do you think Iran will take the Israeli bait of airstrikes? That's interesting. As far as just sort of general, like what's going to happen in Syria, my assumption for a long time has been, my assumption remains that World War III is not happening in Syria. We're not going to get a situation where Russia and the United States come to blows. Russia's just not that strong, frankly, and Russia knows it. What is possible? I was talking about that extraordinarily finely crafted military instrument that Iran has. I mean, they are geared for this sort of fight. They I think it's quite possible that there could be a further escalation between Iran and Israel. I don't think it's going to happen for sure. I feel like I would have to delve a lot more deeply into not just Iranian government statements, but yeah, I'm not confident. Is there a distinct chance that Iran and Israel will come to blows in Syria? Yes, absolutely. Did the chances go up yesterday? Yes, absolutely. But whether that's something that has a 10% chance of happening or a 90% chance of happening, I could not tell you. Keeping up with the tit for tat. For those who don't know, Israel is now in a big uproar about the possibility that the end of the Iran deal will mean that Iran attacks Israel. But they've been bombing. There have been literally hundreds of bombing runs in Syria, many of them intentionally killing Iranian soldiers over the past couple of years. So it's just this fascinating hypocrisy where we're allowed to bomb you in the smithereens, but horrors, you might consider doing the same thing. But because of the way the sort of ladders of escalation work, that's where we're at. Israel can continue to bomb Syria with impunity. And if Iran lobs a single missile, then we're in a pretty horrifying place. I think we saw an example of that. I can't remember if it was last month or a couple months before that, but Iran had a single drone or something like that passed into Israeli airspace. I can't remember. It might even have been in the Golan Heights, which is actually internationally recognized Syrian territory, but that Israel has occupied for the past 50 years or so. So a single Iranian drone violated Iranian airspace, Israeli airspace. So there were something like 20 attacks by Israeli jets and massive bombing of Syria. So that's the sort of mismatch of escalation that the international community, led by the United States, will allow. So I think Iran has to consider, like, yeah, it's really screwed up that Israel is just allowed to kill us on the ground trying to help our ally in Syria. That's screwed up. But we know that if we actually lob a single missile back at them, then Israel can wipe us off the map. I think that can wipe them out. Okay, that's an overstatement. But what is understated is the amount of power that Israel actually has to bring to bear. They're sort of conventionally seen as losing the war in Lebanon in 2006, and I think that's accurate. I think that they did lose that, but they lost it not because the Israeli fighting person isn't, didn't have the gumption, or because they didn't have the weaponry they needed. They lost it because all 21st century wars are media wars, and that's true for Israel more than anybody else. They killed 10 times more Lebanese than Israelis died in that war, but they had to restrain themselves. If it's ever a point where Israel actually looks like, that's also kind of crazy. Many people see Israel's involvement in Lebanon in 2006 as a loss for Israel, but 10 times more Arabs died than Israelis in that conflict. It's just kind of a crazy way of looking at that. But if it ever comes to the point where it looks like Israel is in real danger, say like a single Iranian rocket lands in Tel Aviv, knocks down a building, then it's game on. Israel has tremendous conventional weapons capabilities that it does not use. And if Iran escalates in a meaningful way, if Iran does half or a tenth or a 20th of what Israel is doing to Iran in Syria today, then Israel will go nuts, have the complete support of the United States, and probably the support of a lot of other places as well. So I think that's sort of the reality of the sort of Iranian-Israeli, the sort of Iranian-Israeli issue in Syria. Just also, I don't believe that the United States will. I don't think that the United States will be invading Iran. I do think there is a non-zero chance of U.S. escalation against Iran in Iraq and Syria, which is heartbreaking because those countries have suffered so much over the past 15 years. But if there is an actual war between Israel, Iran, and the United States, it's Syria and Iraq that gets it in the teeth again. And that's, there'd certainly be stuff in what is the strait that goes by Iran? Straits of Hormuz, I believe. There'd certainly be all kinds of this, that, and the other thing, but it's, the United States no longer has the financial wherewithal or military dominance wherewithal necessary to invade and take territory in Iran, which is a good thing. So yeah, it would be Iraq and Syria that would be destroyed. Loga Cool Extreme asks, can a second Iran deal be made? My hunch is no. It was an incredibly complex thing that, as I mentioned earlier, that the Obama administration got into. People across the world liked Obama. Obama was an actual deal maker rather than a blowhard who bankrupts companies. The idea of, I haven't seen the Trump administration handle much of anything of any real complexity. They get a lot of credit for new North Korea sanctions, but that doesn't strike me as particularly complicated when, diplomatically or technically, when, Kim Jong-un is throwing together nuclear bombs everywhere, is testing nuclear bombs and throwing missiles at Japan regularly. I think the new sanctions in the UN are kind of a gimme, and the Trump administration doesn't deserve, special credit for that. The Iran deal was not a gimme. Trump doesn't have the capacity to make a deal like that. He still doesn't have all the people in his State Department and other agencies that he needs, and he's fired half the people that he'd hired by now. So no, I don't think a second Iran deal is possible under this administration. Under a new one, it's really hard to say like what the region is going to look like 3 to 4 years from now. There is actually some question. There are questions about the stability of the Iranian regime. I am not an advocate of regime change on any level, but I sure wouldn't be sad if the Iranian people got it together to move further along towards a better system. So there's that. So yeah, as far as the chances of a second Iran deal, very slow, very, very low. More questions. Logo Cool Extreme, how will this affect the North Korea talks? Honestly, um, the I think that's you can find that question discussed everywhere. I don't really. I'm not someone who thinks that we're on the verge of peace breaking out in North Korea. I mean, I think it's an intriguing concept. Sorry, on the Korean Peninsula, I think it's an intriguing concept. I think that's super interesting, and that'd be great. But this is basically Trump giving the North Korean regime what they've wanted for a very long time, a big summit. It would be, people have been talking, it's been interesting, like watching neocons talking about how the horrifying possibility that, Trump's going to get in a room with Kim Jong-un and he's going to be convinced to take our soldiers away from South Korea. And I'm just like, that sounds awesome. So, yeah, I mean, who knows? We'll see. We can, Trump's sort of clownishness can work in our favor for once, perhaps. But I don't think that this sort of one-to-one, they're never going to sign a nuclear deal with us because of what we did to the Iranians. Like, they were never going to sign a meaningful nuclear deal with us anyway. This whole idea that North Korea is going to voluntarily denuclearize it strikes me as ridiculous. The only thing that they could conceivably trade that for, and how would you possibly verify that, would be the United States getting off the Korean Peninsula. And that'd be great. But I really don't see that happening. I don't think that was ever going to happen. So, yeah. Good point. Trees Climbing Gear says the JCPOA was not a treaty. Very good point. If I said it was a treaty, I apologize. It was an agreement. James, okay, I remember John asked something about, John Coombs of the excellent podcast Safe for Democracy, who actually likes being prepared for these conversations, better prepared than I am, so didn't want to jump in on this, but is kind enough to be in the comments. You should check out his podcast, Safe for Democracy. Asks, what are the chances Iran sticks with the terms of the deal anyway, regarding nukes and inspections? I had covered that earlier in the talk. I think that probably not very high, because they have never gotten what they were promised out of this deal. And now that the United States is out of it, they're even less likely to get what they were promised out of the deal. Sorry, now the United States is out of it, Iran is never going to get what they were hoping for out of this deal. So while I think it's possible that this will sort of extend for a while, I call this video the end of the Iran deal for a very good reason. I think that, like I said, there'll probably be a photograph with all the heads of the European countries and Russia and China and was it Javad Zarif? Apologies, the Iranian Foreign Ministry. Apologies for mispronouncing that. They're all going to be shaking hands and it's going to be magical and da. But I think it's 6 months to a year before falling apart. I would love to be proved wrong. I would love it if, it's interesting. As a U.S. citizen, how much do I love the idea of the world developing an ability to decide these issues beyond, without the United States? I think it's on one hand, it's kind of horrifying, the sort of, as someone who tries to consider himself as a patriotic person, to see the United States just not matter. It's kind of horrifying, but also it's kind of hopeful because Washington, D.C. has proved that they're not capable of managing anything. And it's a very sad thing. That said, I don't think we're there yet. I think that Europe is still way too dependent on the United States on a whole range of factors. I've got some videos on FATCA. If you just search, FATCA or FATCA Mo Freedom Foundation, that I think are worth watching because they explain how people really underestimate the amount of power that the United States still has. I don't think Trump, I'm actually 100% confident Trump can't understand things like FATCA. OFAC itself, the agency that oversees sanctions, has incredible power that it's able to exert in crazy ways because of the sort of legal and financial power, and also the legal power that the United States has. International law, I think I've got a video coming up on that pretty soon, is like famously this sort of up in the air concept that means whatever the person in charge wants. Commercial law, a lot less so. And international commercial law international business law is very, very important. And the United States still kind of sets the terms for that. And there are U.S. agencies that are tremendously important. Every bank in the world under FATCA, this is every bank in the world outside of the United States is legally obligated to having a reporting relationship with the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, with the United States Taxing Authority. That's what the FATCA videos are about. The U.S. has a lot of power that is carefully hidden. It's in the minutia of the 40th page of a financing agreement, but it's very much there. So the United States remains powerful in ways that. I think I've had some success putting something like FATCA into a YouTube video, and there are many, many other things like that, where the U.S. power is exerted not in a big, flashy military parade way, but in sort of, like I said, 50th page of a financing agreement way. So the U.S. still has a lot of power. I don't see the world being able to go its own way because of this Iran deal thing, but they'll start thinking about it. This is laying the underpinnings. As I've said over and over, I don't think we're going to see World War III or whatever, or the true fall of American empire during a Trump administration, even if he lasts for 2 terms. It is a tremendous weight of power that the United States has, but spending 4 or 8 years with this approach, and honestly, the approach of the last 2 presidents before him, in a less obvious way. If we spend more time under that approach, then 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, World War III or the crushing of the United States world power becomes dramatically more likely. And that's what Trump does. We're not going to get a catastrophe during his administration, but his actions make a later apocalypse much more likely. All right. Other questions? Chances of Israeli-Lebanon conflict with recent election. That's interesting. I just read about this last night. Hezbollah did well, depending on who you ask. Hezbollah did well in the Lebanon election, and that kind of gets to the whole terror organization thing that we've described earlier. When the United States describes Iran as the main state sponsor of terrorism, they're talking about Hezbollah primarily. Hezbollah I'm going to get this wrong, is a militia in Lebanon devoted to the destruction of Israel. That's definitely what they do. I would consider that aspect of what they do a terrorist, straightforward terrorist thing. But Hezbollah is also an organization that has a real military wing that was able to fight against Israel when it invaded Lebanon. That's kind of a self-defense thing. Also, they are a political party with political negotiation and this, that, and the other thing, and a political program, and they have to make alliances. It's like, can you imagine like Al-Qaeda or ISIS like having people in a parliament trying to, do the what's horse trading, do political horse trading? No, it's ridiculous. So yes, I know many would disagree, but I would call Hezbollah a terrorist organization. But you're kind of making the word meaningless in a way if you include something like Hezbollah, which is much more complex and has a lot more sympathy in the world, frankly, to something like ISIS, but that's what the United States does. And that's also what a lot of the reporting about the Lebanese election is doing. So if I get this, Lebanese politics is some of the most fiendishly complex in the world. I need to read about 5 more books on it. But my understanding is that the Hezbollah, the party, outright won like 1/3 of the seats, and then there are other parties that they are aligned with that get them to a supermajority or something along those lines. But I read an analysis of it that I think makes the case that it's not quite as bad as they thought, because it's politics, and it's horse trading. And now that Hezbollah, in a democratic, this is in a democratic context, or not democratic context, in the context of a representative body, now has more power, that means that the other folks are more anti them. And there are elements in Israel that are adding this sort of fuel to the fire, are using this to claim that Hezbollah now, I think the Hezbollah equals Lebanon is something that's been said. I think it would be equally as fair to say the United States equals Trump, which I really hope people don't do. And actually, Lebanon does not have that much power. They do not have the presidency. They do not have the prime ministership. Actually, because they can't, right? Yeah, because I think the two main, Lebanon is a very screwed up place. The two main heads of state positions are reserved for a Christian and a Sunni Muslim, I believe, and Hezbollah is a Shia organization. I could be getting all of this wrong. Lebanon is super complex. Did the chances go up of another Israeli attack on Lebanon? Yes, but I don't see how the benefit they have there. I think they're more interested probably in continuing to kill Iranians in Syria, and I think that's a flashpoint I'm a little more worried about. I don't think the IDF is super excited to go back to southern Lebanon after the 2006 experience. That said, if Hezbollah decides to start raining missiles on Israeli population centers, then that changes, and the approach that Israel takes. I think you can fairly assume that this sort of 10-to-1 casualty ratio is going to continue in any conflict with Israel and one of its neighbors. 10 Palestinians or Lebanese dies for every one Israeli. That's just, it's surprising how well that holds up, actually. So some wonder if that's somebody's policy, which is horrifying. So I do think that if Iran gets lucky and kills 100 Israelis, then Israel will feel justified and probably won't get too much pushback on killing 10,000 Lebanese people, and they have the resources to do that. So yeah, it's really sad and something that I really hope doesn't happen. Questions. Does anybody have a question? Let's see, I'm scrolling up here. Oh, we've got some Viva Hezbollah. Okay, Luke Skywalker, I know I've got some, I welcome all viewers, What are the odds of Israel confronting Iran more directly in Lebanon given the recent election result? That was from Avizena. I answered that. Zach Osborne also asked a question on that. Do you see a nuclear arms race between Saudi Arabia and Iran happening in the near future? Asked Sender 2457. This is a place where I agree with the Standard story. Gosh, I think even Trump mentioned it yesterday, and I would agree with that. Yeah, if Iran gets a bomb, we get a pretty horrifying situation where everybody else in the region wants a bomb as well. And Saudi Arabia can very quickly get a bomb. I think it's pretty much just buy it from Pakistan, who they fund to a great extent. And that's the real horror show. And that's also getting once again to this distinction between sort of Saudi-funded terror and Iran-funded terror. I'd trust Hezbollah with a nuclear bomb more than I'd trust the Saudi Arabian monarchy, like by far. Because, Hezbollah wants to, I don't know if you've looked at any of ever looked at a map of that region, but if you nuke Israel, you also nuke Lebanon. That's how nuclear weapons work. That's not something that Hezbollah is going to do, because Hezbollah is a terror organization that makes political points in parliaments and does actually operates complicated military organizations, and has policies and a vision for the future. Saudi Arabia and the folks that they fund, like ISIS and Al Qaeda, those really are apocalyptic types. And I'd say there's a non-zero chance of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian governing or apparatus coming under the control of somebody with that kind of view, those kinds of views, with ISIS-style views. So yeah, totally. I mean, I don't want any of these people to have nuclear weapons. I don't want Israel to have nuclear weapons. I don't want Russia or the United States to have nuclear weapons, quite honestly. Though I do believe in U.S. holding on to its deterrent. I think I might have just given John an aneurysm. Anyway, the point that I'm making there is like, that's also, it's like, yeah, a nuclear race could start between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. would be like, oh yeah, let's ignore Saudi Arabia and focus like a laser on Iran and their nuclear issue, and then Saudi Arabia has a bomb and ends the world. I think that's kind of plausible, actually. Saudi Arabia is a vastly more dangerous country than Iran is. But yeah, that's somewhere where I agree with sort of like the standard story, like the standard approach. Like there is absolutely something to worry about. Iran getting a nuclear bomb would absolutely lead to larger issues, and that's to be worried about. Questions. Why is the USA so prompt in fighting the wars of Israel? Asks Kulad Buzbahi. The standard answer to that is IPAC and the Zionist lobby, or what have you. I think that's wrong. The United States has a tremendous interest in instability somewhere. Throughout the 60s and 70s, it was Southeast Asia, sort of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, dropped. Gosh, I'm sure John, if he's still in the chat, can tell you how many pounds of bombs were dropped in Southeast Asia by the U.S. military-industrial complex. Not a lot of Zionist entities to be protected there. The amount of churn that we get from this instability is tremendously valuable to the U.S. economy, the U.S. defense contractors, and I've got videos talking about why U.S. arms contractors are so effective. And Israel is a very useful tool for that. There's this sort of conventional approach that, IPAC and the Likud party control the U.S. government. I sometimes think that Netanyahu thinks that's what's up. Actually, the truth is, like IPAC, this is the American Israeli Public Affairs Council, which is one of hundreds of organizations that work to influence Israeli policy in the United States, but this one has become the sort of bugaboo. I believe that IPAC and Israel's Likud party, the U.S. government doesn't work for them. Like those entities work for me as a U.S. investor, as somebody who's got a retirement account. It's all economic churn. That's what this death and destruction of the Middle East is primarily. And yeah, I mean, some of the dumber ideas of IPAC and certain elements in Israel are grabbed onto because it gives us the excuse to bomb stuff. Both the United States and Israel are tremendously invested in having an enemy, because if we have an enemy that's scary, we don't have to look at ourselves. Israel doesn't have to look at what it's doing to the Palestinians. The United States doesn't have to look at, what it's done to dozens at this point. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say. I mean, no, not every place that the U.S. military has been involved has been destroyed utterly. But you look at Yemen, you look at Iraq, you look at Syria, you look at Somalia, and these horrific damage that we've done in these places that we can only justify if there's somebody out there that's worse. And that's what Iran has done. Iran is the boogeyman. Iran is those scary guys in those crazy turbans, that we can use to justify ourselves to ourselves. So this idea that we're fighting Israel's wars. No, Israel's fighting our wars. As I had mentioned earlier, like this doesn't help the cause of Zionism at all. These countries will eventually be at peace, and they will eventually be in better shape than they are today. I think we're beginning to see that in Iraq, the sort of a real country developing there, and they will remember. They will remember what Israel was participated in what the United States did to them. And unlike the United States, that's going to be far away. Israel's going to be right there. So, no, I don't think we're fighting Israel's wars. I think Israel is a useful pawn for us in keeping the wars going, because that's what we love. More questions. Man, Tommy T asks, what about Yemen's island that UAE, the United Arab Emirates, captures? I am, embarrassed that I haven't. I think I need to revive. I've got a 5-part Yemen series that I think is very good. Actually, it's up to 8 or 9 parts, but there's sort of the first 5 parts on Yemen. I think do a pretty good job. People have been very kind to me. I sort of did a lot of reading on Yemen and sort of put out what I thought about the conflict and went back to Yemen's history for a while. I think what that leaves out, and I need to do sort of an addendum, is talking about the role of the United Arab Emirates in that conflict. Saudi Arabia is sort of just mercilessly pounding that country and making a complete ass of itself. It's failing utterly. It's the brutality and the imperialism I object to, but also they just look like infant children, how poorly they're mismanaging this conflict in Yemen. It's like Keystone Cops, except with serious mental incapacities. It's a mess. The United Arab Emirates, however, is actually playing a more involved game. They've now occupied the island of Socotra. Socotra, I have no idea how to pronounce that. It's this crazy island off the coast of Yemen with these trees that only grow there. It used to be a fantastic tourist destination. The United Arab Emirates, both there and in the southern port of Aden, is sort of supporting different militias than the Saudis are supporting. The whole justification for the Saudi coalition, which includes the United Arab Emirates, the United States, NATO, a whole bunch of assholes, the whole justification for this is supporting the internationally recognized president who has been in the Saudi Arabian capital since the beginning of the conflict and is still there today. But the UAE is actually, within this coalition, is supporting people who are against that supposedly internationally recognized president, who can't even control the small sliver of Yemen that has actually been taken. So the UAE, what it's doing is it has occupied Socotra, this very beautiful and strategic island on this trade route, and it's occupied Aden, the city that was the capital of South Yemen and used to be one of the greatest ports in the world in the early 20th century, and has occupied these strategic places, and they're probably just not going to let go. It's a very straightforward invasion and colonial occupation. And Saudi Arabia is just the big dumbass blundering around getting its capital bombed. And the UAE is just slowly plucking off the most important bits. And it's really, really disturbing to watch. This is the kind of great power hogwash that we told ourselves was done with. This is why we initially went to war against Iraq in 1990, 1991. This is what we were supposedly fighting against in the Middle East. And now we're defending it. Now we're bombing on behalf of it. So yeah, I need to talk about that more. There's a lot I need to talk about. I'm trying to write a book on the British Empire, folks. Can't focus on Yemen all the time, but I should. So that's a great question. I don't have much to say to that. Why won't China save Iran, Rob? Asked Loga Cool Extreme. Why would China want to save Iran? China can look at this just sort of absurd, massive issues around the Middle East and around what's being done to it, and realize that it wants to stay out of it. I put up a video Tuesday talking about how I'm a little more concerned, or I think it's a little more likely that China might get involved in it. Why would it want to jump into the Middle East? It just wants oil, and anybody who's in charge is going to pay for it. Interesting, is going to sell it to them. Interestingly, this should be the United States attitude to the Middle East, but it's not, because we like war. So yeah, I don't think China has any real natural affinity with the Iranians or the Persians, and I will say China's going to keep buying oil from Iran, no matter what happens with the sanctions. China and India both are going to keep buying it, whether probably not officially, but unofficially. So they're going to be helping Iran in that sense. Okay. Son of Kemet asks, if a war breaks out between Iran and Israel, do you think it will be held over Lebanon, and would Israel lose its air advantage after Iran receives S-300s and S-400 systems? Is Iran really going to get S-300 and S-400 systems? I mean, I know Syria has S-300s. Once again, I'm not a military guy. My belief, once again, I am not a military guy, but I'm fairly confident that people are really underestimating the degree to which, like the strategic considerations, the tactical considerations, I can never figure that out. People are mistaking the considerations that Israel has to fight the media war for actual lack of power or actual lack of investment. What's the word? Actual lack of ability. I don't think that Israel will lose its air advantage. Is there a possibility that some Israeli planes would get shot down? Yes, quite possible. But I think that with the full range of Israeli options, and it would absolutely be supported by the United States. I think even if the S-300s and the S-400s are this sort of magical weapon that they've been pitched to be, I think most air defense stuff is tremendously exaggerated. I don't think it would slow Israel down for more than a couple days in a real war in Iran over Syria. I think that's very different when you start looking at Iran itself. I think that the expanse of that country, and not because they might have S-300s or S-400s or this, that, and the other thing, and just the size of Iran and the depth with which they must have anti-aircraft stuff installed. Okay, Damrock's dude has chimed in to say that Iran has the S-300 and Syria does not. Thanks, folks. Always nice to get that sort of crowd sourced. I joined late. I'll have to rewatch it. And then, so Keith D'Antonio asks, I joined late. I'll have to rewatch it when I have time. Let me ask you this. Is Iran cheating or not? No, Iran is not cheating on the terms of the nuclear deal. The IAEA has certified that. The Secretary of Defense of the United States believes that. The leader of the Israeli Defense Forces believes that. They have not been cheating. They have been complying with this deal. As I talked about earlier, and you should look into, what Trump did in his announcement of pulling out of the Iran deal is he tried to put a whole bunch of stuff into this deal that isn't there. He talked about, Iran having an independent, self-defense oriented foreign policy, as if that was violating. Okay, that's perhaps a little underselling what Iran is doing in the broader region, but I do believe it is for their self-defense. So what he's doing is taking stuff like missile technology and other things that are not a part of the nuclear deal and trying to make them part of the deal afterwards, which is nuts. So yes, Iran was not cheating. They were complying with the deal. Everybody agrees with that. Even people like Secretary of Defense James Mattis, who really, really hate Iran. So yeah. No, that's interesting. Logo Cool Extreme asks, what is Turkey's role and position in the Iran deal? My understanding is it does not have one, which I'm sure they're annoyed about. Gosh, I think, was there some thing with, I'm sorry, half-remembered historical thing. Oh, wow, is that a super chat? I've never seen that before. So apparently you can donate money through the chatting, which is kind of cool. And thank you to Trees Climbing Gear. That was very cool. Very cool of you to do. Thank you. Where was I? I was talking about, oh yes, Iran has complied with the terms of the nuclear deal, and Trump is lying to get you to think they are. See, question. Thoughts on Gina Haspel becoming head of the CIA? I think that's atrocious. I think that, well, I don't know if she should have been fired. She did do what she was ordered. She shouldn't lose her pension or whatever. But the idea that we should reward somebody who participated in the U.S. program of torture is horrifying. I think it's insane. Wow. Thanks, Max Payne to the Max. Appreciate that donation. It's very kind of you. What was I going to say? We're talking about Gina Haspel. For those who don't know, Gina Haspel is Trump's nominee to be the head of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and she was involved in torture programs. She was involved in the United States torture programs and may have led some elements of it. And I believe there's some discussion that she may have destroyed some of the records. It's absurd that she would be made the head of the CIA. I'm not a fan of that. Will gas prices go up? Will gas prices go up? Asked Stan Cormier. I think yes, actually, definitely. I think that if this sort of process continues, gas prices will go up. Will it go up to an oil price of $100 a barrel? I still doubt that, but it has broken. It's now at 4-year highs. It's still the barrel of oil is still $30-$40 below what it was just a while back. But isolated to the degree that the United States wants, baked into the prices. I think the fact that everybody knew this was coming may be the. Let's see. Question. Fatel Gueda asks, do you think that the U.S. will hold back from invading Iran because of the big deficit? It sure should. I think the U.S. will hold back from invading Iran because it's something that would cost U.S. lives. And the United States is no longer really interested in getting involved in things that cost U.S. lives on a large number. They've figured out that as long as U.S. soldiers aren't dying, the U.S. public doesn't care. And I think an Iraq-style invasion of Iran would be tremendously more difficult. We are in tremendously more debt, and it would kill tremendously more U.S. soldiers. So I just don't see that happening. I don't think there will be. I think the fight between the U.S. and Iran, which is possible, would happen in Iraq and Syria, and that's horrifying. Okay. Questions? I'm beginning to fade a bit here, but I am happy to answer more questions. Loga Cool Extreme S, is Saudi Arabia out of hot water now? And my answer is no. Saudi Arabia is still finished. The fact that we've gone from $35 to $70, $35 to $70 per barrel of oil may seem impressive, but it's still not $110. And I've got a recent video on that called Saudi Arabia is Still Finished that talks about that. Let's see here. Ali Nedhaif talks about gas prices are going to go up because Iran started selling for euros instead of dollars. Man, I really need to focus more on monetary stuff. If anybody's got a good book on monetary policy, I just don't. It's really hard for me to understand what people are talking about with the petrodollar thing, because I think a lot of it is rooted in some basic misunderstandings, but I don't know enough to fully describe what those misunderstandings are. But no, I think that is a really, Ali Nedhaif makes a great point that the price of the dollar is very important for the price of oil. These things are deeply connected, and I should be able to better vocalize that. But I can't because I don't understand those concepts as well as I should. So, it's all right. Okay. Let's see. What can Trump do to reduce the oil prices at this point with all that's happened? I don't really know that oil prices need to be reduced, frankly. Sort of looking at this, I see petrostates, even at this level, not being able to sort of petrostate bad actors, not being able to do what they want to do. At this level, the basic exploration that we need to keep doing will get done. And also at this level, the whole electric car revolution becomes a lot more viable. I think it's crazy that we've gotten up to 1 or 2% of the car fleet, at least in the developed world, something like 70% in Norway or something like that. Maybe not that high, but it's closing in on 50% in Norway as electric cars. The fact that we've done that over the past 3 or 4 years, when oil prices have been, in the gutter, is pretty freaking amazing. Now we're back up at 70, and yes, that's producing lots of. It seems like at this point, this may be overstated, that sort of India and China are sucking up enough oil that shale hasn't been able to get the oil price back below $60 a barrel for a while. But up at this point, if we do stay at $70 a barrel, that just means that people get more interested in electric cars. So it's got a good result. I don't necessarily believe that oil prices need to come down, but Trump's got a lot of different mechanisms he could use if he wanted to, mostly just pressuring Saudi Arabia. I think at this price point, I think we are already starting to see the OPEC Russia deal start to fall apart. So yeah, I think I still don't think we're going to continue to have these prices at this point. So there's that. Okay. Any last questions? Because I got about 3 hours of sleep last night. Read a lot about Iran. Not happy about this. What do you think of Saudi Arabia acting as Soleimani's air force in Iraq against the Sunnis of Iraq, i.e., is the animosity between Saudi and Iranian regimes not just for show? Oh, that's interesting. So I assume you're referring to Saudi Arabian participation in the coalition against ISIS, which also involves Iran. Is the animosity? No, I do not believe that the animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran is just for show. I think it's Iran has the Iranian theocratic regime has sort of threatened Saudi Arabia sort of at its core for a very long time. Their justification has always been their investment in Islam, Islamic leadership, Islamic, radicalism or whatnot. And when Iran sort of came out of left field in 1979, being like, oh no, wait, we're the true leaders of the Islamic Revolution, the Saudis were just sort of like, and I think that has a lot to do with a lot of the horror we've seen in terms of Saudi promotion of this sort of Sunni jihadist ideology. So no, I don't think it's all just for show. I think that political actors act strategically. Like sometimes they will. I mean, the classic example would be the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1940, the non-aggression pact between Stalin and Hitler. The whole justification, one of the main justifications for the Nazi Party was to fight the communists, both in Germany and abroad. I mean, that was a huge part of the Nazi ideology, was being anti-communist. And then in 1940, Hitler signed an agreement with Stalin, the communist nightmare person. Obviously, this fell apart in a pretty dramatic way. But as far as strategic stuff, I think both Saudi Arabia and Iran, for different reasons, had trouble with ISIS and were willing to sort of get together and bash them about. But to some degree, I'm not 100%. I think you might be overstating that with saying that Saudi Arabia was acting as Iran's air force. I don't, have a tremendous amount of respect for Saudi Arabia's air force. So yeah, well, they would have worked together for a bit. I think it's overstating things to say that they were somehow, they're not really enemies. They're really enemies. That I do believe in. I do not believe in this idea of Shia and Sunni eternal hatred. No, it's a very sort of, the Saudi regime's justification was threatened and undercut by the Iranian regime's theocratic justification from 1979 onward. This is not a story of 1,200 or 1,300 years of dispute between Shia and Sunni. It's as with most of the issues with Islam that I describe on this channel, it's a question of decades and political issues and questions, not this broader thing. Okay. Iran. Keith Antonia asks, do you lean towards Shiite, not Sunni? I don't have a dog in that fight. Shia or Sunni, I don't. I really dislike what Saudi Arabia's version of Sunni ideology is, that has been exported to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, as I think any thinking person does. But honestly, I could, if forced to, I could maybe describe in any detail the difference between Shia and Sunni. It's sort of a historically based issue, and there's also subdivisions without that. But yeah, I'm not Muslim. I don't know the details of these ideologies. I don't lean towards one or the other. Once again, it's not about Shia or Sunni. It's about the politics of the past couple decades or half century, maybe going that far back. It's not about a preference for one or another ideology I don't understand. Tammy T asks, did Xi Jinping and Trump make a deal where Trump got free hands for North Korea and Xi Jinping got Iran's oil? Nope. No, I don't think that happened. I think that China will say nice words about complying with whatever sanctions that the U.S. puts forward, and will ignore them, as would have happened anyway. I don't think that's really it's a deal, because Xi Jinping isn't really getting anything out of that. As far as, I haven't looked into the North Korea issue in much detail. As far as detail on Xi Jinping and China's current attitude towards North Korea, I haven't read those articles. I haven't looked into that. I know that there's this weird tension, as there always has been. It's like China really benefits from having this psycho country. Perhaps that's an inelegant way of putting it. Having this sort of very bad international actor, right there in Asia for everybody to focus on, but it doesn't benefit from it being truly disruptive. So it's sort of a give and take. So as far as the current relationship, I couldn't speak to that. Thoughts on China building artificial, Fatal Gueda asks, thoughts on China building artificial islands in the South China Sea. This is a video I've been meaning to make for years. We sort of obsess over what China's doing in the South China Sea, and it is aggressive, and it is unpleasant. What they're doing is they're taking disputed islands. I'm not sure if this particular clutch of islands, and I spent some time looking at the Caribbean and Puerto Rico this week, and islands are confusing. So there's a bunch of islands in the South China Sea, some of which many are claimed by China, some are claimed by the Philippines, some are claimed by Vietnam. So over the past, 5 years or so, 10 years, China has decided to build the facts on the ground here by actually dumping a whole bunch of cement on these uninhabited rocks, turning them into airports and military bases, this sort of thing. This is seen as this crazy, terrible, aggressive thing that China is doing. And it's aggressive, and it's really unfortunate. But the way I see that is kind of an offshoot of the pivot to Asia. Obama famously failed, but at least intended to pivot more resources from the U.S. government to Asia, away from the Middle East. Obviously, that was a bit of a failure. Well, I guess there's probably less troops on the ground now anyway. But that was a failure. But wanted to pivot stuff towards Asia. And there were a whole range of diplomatic accomplishments. They were accomplishments if you were down with the goal of antagonizing China. And that's what they were doing, what was happening. In Australia, we now have a military base in Australia, which is kind of new and aggressive. It's small, but it's sort of new and aggressive against China. There are a number of other things. We now have an agreement. I don't know if we're actually doing it yet, but we now are able to sell arms to Vietnam, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Our old enemy in Vietnam is now very much a part of our military-industrial complex infrastructure. And I think most importantly was Burma. Myanmar or Burma. Nobody's ever really been able to explain to me what the appropriate approach is to that. Myanmar or Burma was very heavily in the Chinese camp for a very long time, sort of ruled by a military junta and sort of pro-Chinese or leave us alone, let us do what we want. And what I think still is an accomplishment of the Obama administration and even Hillary Clinton, something she did as Secretary of State that was at all worthwhile, was sort of opening Burma up to the West, to an approach towards democracy. Of course, in practice, the most famous thing that this has yielded is the sort of genocide or quasi-genocide against the Rohingya minority of Burma. So it hadn't been great. But, it is nice to see countries transition from military juntas to an attempt at representative democracy under Nobel Peace Prize winners. And that's what happened in Burma. But what that was for China, a country on their border getting carved off. Like, it would be like if, it's exactly like we flipped out when Cuba went communist. Like, it's at that level. It's like a Cuban Missile Crisis threat to China that nobody ever really discussed from that perspective. So if you look at what China's doing in the South China Sea from the perspective of us carving off Myanmar, military bases in Australia, arming Vietnam, then it looks a lot more understanding. And as also actually the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was a trade deal aimed specifically at China's lifeblood, aimed specifically at the foreign trade that China relies upon. If you looked at it in that context, then you can see why the South China Sea stuff was done. It's like sort of a desperate attempt to save face. It's not like some crazy action. All right, we are now crossing the 2-hour mark, and while I see that there are great questions here, I think I have to call it here. I'm so grateful to the 65 folks that are still watching. I think for the first time we had 100 people watching live, which is tremendously exciting, and I'm very grateful for. That's interesting. Ask Faisal says, the ruling military junta changed its name from Burma to Myanmar in 1989. The change was recognized by the United Nations, but not by the United States and the UK. That's interesting. Right then, thank you all so much for coming and participating in this. Thank you to the folks who actually donated through the chat system. I've never seen that before. That's very cool. I'm very grateful. That's very kind of you. I'm Robert Morris. I run the More Freedom Foundation, YouTube channel dedicated to trying to save the world, looking at geopolitics and whatever other issues crop up in my head from a perspective of sanity, which we don't get from U.S. media or government. You can find me here at this YouTube channel. I suggest you click the subscribe button. You can find me on Twitter at RoboLaw, on Instagram as @TheGoldenAge. I'm not very consistent with my branding. I have a website, www.morefreedomfoundation.com, and you can find a range of donation options both on my website and on the front page of this YouTube channel. You go to sort of click About on the top menu. Currently trying to finish a book called Avoiding the British Empire that will compare the United States to the British Empire and see what lessons the U.S. Empire can learn to avoid the British Empire's tragic fall. And I think with that, I'm going to close and take a nap. Thank you all so much for showing up and participating, and y'all are the best. I hope you found this useful. Many thanks. I am now going to click on the thing that ends this. Very grateful. Thanks for coming.